Good evening to all of you, to all our friends in CMC, to those in the mission hospitals, to our alumni network, and to our wider network of health providers across India and in other countries. The Pulse Lecture series from CMC is to share accurate, up-to-date, and relevant information that can inform practice based on our experience at CMC Vellore. Today is the fifth lecture in the series, which is focusing on the most important topic of communication, non-escalation, and end-of-life care for COVID-19. One of the most fundamental ways that COVID has changed the way we practice medicine is how we communicate with patients and families. Patients are alone, and we have to be their families. We have to support families on the phone to make difficult decisions. We are also confronting death on a scale that we have not had to do in recent times. COVID is teaching us or reteaching us the essence of medicine, how to communicate with our patients. So there's one topic that we should discuss in the Pulse Lecture series is actually how to communicate with our patients. For today's talk, we have three speakers: Dr. Punita from the Department of Medicine, Dr. Jennifer Jebba, the head of palliative care medicine, and Reverend Arul Das, the chaplain of CMC Vellore. And to chair the session today, we have Dr. Tarun K. George, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Medicine, and I'll hand over to him now.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another session of this Pulse series. With the ongoing rapidly changing guidelines, the relevance of this series has been paramount. Among hospitalized patients, depending on the context, the prevalence of severe and critical illness could be anywhere around 10%. Our patients are alone, isolated away from families. They are talking to astronauts in hazmat suits with N95 masks, goggles, or even visors. The financial situation is catastrophic and decision making is painful. The care of those with significant pre-morbid illnesses, the elderly and the poor, offers several ethical and spiritual dilemmas that healthcare workers have to deal with. Many of these patients may end up with a plan of non-escalation of care, and dealing with these end-of-life issues can be shattering for the families and the team. Today we have three eminent speakers to talk about these challenges. Before they start, as you all come up with questions, please put them in the chat box, and I request you all to direct the question to the concerned speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. J.V. Punita. She's an associate professor in the Department of General Medicine, Unit 1. Her expertise as a psychiatrist with years of experience in counseling HIV patients and as a past coordinator for World Vision, along with being an astute physician, brings a unique and valuable perspective in the care of her patients. Handing over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Tarun, for those kind words. Without much ado, I will move on to my presentation. So I've been asked to cover aspects of communication of doctor with patient, doctor with relative, with a focus on when not to escalate care, and on withholding or withdrawing therapy. When we talk about doctor-patient relationship and communication, we are talking about that therapeutic relationship between the doctor and the patient. We all know the foundational principles of effective communication that makes a difference. Establishing rapport, listening actively and to ensure mutual understanding. We also know that in the medical field, our communication should translate to compassionate care, and in many ways that can be equated to our availability to our patients – and perhaps walking that extra mile with them And the therapeutic implications of this relationship is very true in our interactions in patients with COVID-19. The key in all interactions and effective communication is understanding. As Julian Treasure puts it, you impact patients powerfully when you listen to them attentively, making understanding the norm in all your communications. Now, when it comes to COVID, the first step is to understand the unique challenges that COVID poses to effective communication. But let's back up a little bit and start with doctors and communication. Now, doctors traditionally have had a bad reputation of being poor listeners and therefore poor communicators. This was backed up with evidence way back in 1984 when a study was done and published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, a study that revealed that 69% of doctors interrupted their patients within 18 seconds during the medical interview for various reasons. Now, since 1984, we've come a long way. The importance of communication has been understood by the medical professionals, and training and communication skills have been incorporated into the medical curriculum. And well, many of us have become very good communicators. Then, all too suddenly, the COVID pandemic seemed to have undone this progress in communication skills among doctors in 2020. Or has it? Let's see. So we went back to square one or worse. Not just interrupting conversation, but just not listening to patients at all. Perhaps that was the first step that happened, and we had our valid excuses. We had the PPE, we had to do physical distancing, and anyway, we said we will speak to the relatives over the phone. We know the diagnosis, so I really don't need to get to the talk about clinical symptoms. Well, the patient cannot see us, so on and so forth. So what do I do during my shift? At least in CMC, that's what we were doing, at least initially. I just stand at the foot end of the bed, hand over the case details to my colleague or to the rounding consultant, as the case is, and move on. When it came to examination of the patient, too many of us were merely looking at the saturation monitor and entering an approximate respiratory rate. We can't blame anyone, can we? How can you possibly try to put on a stethoscope, and sometimes you don't even have an earpiece on it, through the PP and make sense? Just forget it. If you need to have an accurate picture, then do an ABG that gives you all that you need to know about the patient. So I guess we really hit rock bottom at some point in time with regards to this therapeutic communication, at least some of us. If we were to be honest with ourselves, we would agree on many of the things that have been mentioned so far. Well, was this behavior contributed by fear? Perhaps. What if I get it? And worse, what if I transmit it to a loved one at home? One nurse told me, "Doctor, I was cooking at home and the spicy flavor caused me to sneeze. And immediately my husband shouted at me saying, 'Wear that mask, don't come and spread corona in the house.'" Other major challenges were discussing management options and prognosis with relatives over the phone, especially when there are limited ICU beds, and trying to discuss finances as well. When at the same time the patient may be dying, how does one do all this? And if you're a person who believes in afterlife, what about the spiritual dialogues? Did COVID have the last say with regards to communication? No. The amazing thing about our doctors and other healthcare workers is that they chose to make a difference at such a time as this, to be human and to do what they have been called to do to their best, walking that extra mile to make a difference to the COVID patient and their relatives. I just want to share a few stories from the ward. Now, I want to talk to you about Dr. V and the healing touch. It was a registrar's journey. The registrar had faced all of the challenges that were listed out in the previous slide. And in an essence, he felt that he had lost his sense of purpose, and he didn't care what, his training was all about. He felt, he was not going anywhere. But at some point of time, he said, enough is enough. I need to make a change. I need to make a difference. See, he made a decision to do something more. So during the 6-hour shift in the ward, he would go to the bedside and introduce himself to all the patients, hold their hands, encourage the patients to talk with their relatives via his mobile phone. The patient whom he felt that had impacted most was a 40-year-old COVID patient who had a recent RTA that had left him hemiplegic and aphasic, Mr. S. He would just hold his hands and use his mobile phone to facilitate video conversation via WhatsApp to his relatives. Often about a half a dozen of his relatives would take turns and talk to the patient every day. However, Dr. V's turn in the wards was getting over. On the last day, Dr. V went to every patient and told every patient, from tomorrow, I will not be coming. Some other doctor will be coming to take care of you. Now, when he said this to Mr. S, who was hemiplegic and aphasic, Mr. S just held on to his hand, refused to let it go for a full 20 minutes. It is that time Dr. V realized how lonely these patients must be feeling. Thankfully for Mr. S, a few days into his hospital days, 2-3 days later, he was finishing his total quarantine of the 24, and he was actually shifted to a non-COVID ward where his relatives could be with him. And then ultimately he did go home, and that was the information that I got. So this story really highlights the importance of the doctor-patient relationship and the importance of facilitating communications between the patient and his relatives, especially those who are very sick, those who can't do it by themselves. Just want to talk to you about another story about this patient, the dying patient, who said, hold my hand. We were rounding in the ward one day, and suddenly another patient on the other side was creating such a ruckus. He was an elderly man who belonged to the Muslim faith, and he was really agitated. So our entire team went there and asked him, what's troubling you? And he said, don't you see, I am dying. So we were a little taken aback. Generally, we feel uncomfortable to talk about death, dying issues. And here was a patient telling us he was on 100% reservoir bag, he was agitated, he was telling he's dying. And so we were a little taken aback, but then we just said, so what would you like us to do for you? Do you want us to call your relatives? Can we, give a call to your son? He said, no, just hold my hand. It was amazing that, the man just wanted somebody to be with him. And at that time, we had an intern who was also from the same faith, and he just said, ma'am, I'll be there. And of course, he also had requested that he be given a bath. So we gave them, the sisters went there, gave him a bath, and our intern was holding his hand. Maybe I was imagining, but I felt there was such a peace. This man was so agitated, was so peaceful. And then within 5-10 minutes later, he actually passed on. So there was nothing much that we did, but I think we still did a lot. Moving on to things about death and dying, most of the patients in the ward are actually very, very afraid of dying. Thanks to the media coverage, vivid pictures globally, exaggerated news. And so you walk up to them and ask them, what are your fears? And that opens up a whole lot of things, and they're able to express their fears. Sometimes people cry. Sometimes, they just talk about their fears. Often, I tell them about New Start. Just hold their hands and we talk to them about, tell them about the statistics saying, about 100 patients, maybe around 5 people will become critically ill. And I talked to them about the 1918 Spanish flu as well, where so many people were dying, whereas in a monastery, more than 200 people were there and none of them died. What are the things that they followed? They just followed this acronym New Start: nutrition, exercise, water, sunshine, temperance, air, rest, and trust in God. So when you talk to them about nutrition, of course, they complain saying, oh, the hospital diet is so poor. We said, no, you'll get better. It's because of the disease. We talked to them about exercise and said, what do you mean by exercise? We are in the ward. He said, no, you're going to go home. So that gives them a hope. And then you go through the other aspects. Talking about death to patients and, relieves their fear. And oftentimes, gives them a space to talk about it, talk about their hopes. And even if they are really dying, then they have their last wishes which they express. Very important to get that. And often patients also ask for prayer. Thankfully, all our people, no matter what faith they belong to, are people who are God-fearing and do invite prayer. A few more stories, more difficult conversations. Conversation of the doctor to the relatives on difficult issues as to when to escalate, when to withhold therapy, or to withdraw therapy. What we felt really helped in this communication was, clear algorithms for clinical decision. Obviously, we are so overwhelmed with so many patients, and you do have limited beds, especially ICU beds. So our teams here, Dr. Anand Zakaria and his team, they had this algorithm and prioritization criteria where people as to who could get admitted into the ICU, who would benefit from ICU care, who wouldn't benefit so much from ICU care. So this really helped us, people working in the wards, on the floor, having this clarity on who would benefit, who wouldn't benefit. It really made a big difference in making decisions in the ward. The other thing that really distressed many of our doctors was the fact, you have limited beds. There is a young person who comes in, and then for want of ICU beds, you say, okay, do not intubate. So we were discussing, and there were back and forth discussions between the doctors on the floor and the seniors and the ICU teams. So we said we came up with what is called the best ward care. So we tell our patients, relatives and patient, we'll take you in. As of now, we don't have an ICU bed, but we will give you the best possible care. And if you require ICU care and if there's a bed that is available, we will allocate that bed for you. Now, having these algorithms and having clarity on this really enabled us. Let me just illustrate with two stories, real events which happened. Mr. S. Now, when he got in, he's a weaver, 55-year-old man with no comorbidities. But for want of beds and want of finances, at the initial phase, he was labeled as DNI, DNR. So when the team saw him in the ward, this was revisited, and we said, no, this is a patient who would actually benefit with ICU care. So we spoke to the son, and the son, we found out, was also a medical student in the government Vellore Hospital. He was doing his final year, and in a few days' time, he would be taking up his exams. So we went back, because finances was definitely an issue. We went back to the unit consultant in chief, and then they said, yes, we will help this patient. He will definitely benefit with ICU care. So we went ahead with the ICU care, and thankfully this patient actually walked out. In fact, I called him yesterday because I said I'm going to tell his details, and I wanted to know how he's doing. He's well, and he's back to his work. Of course, the son is still awaiting his results. Now, on the other hand, we had Mr. B. He was 84-year-old man, a businessman, very well-to-do, but he fell into the category 3, that means low priority for ICU. He did have comorbidities. But our team in the wards did not give up. He was on 100% reservoir for nearly 2-3 weeks. Surprisingly, he made it. He walked back home. And I know through the there were 2 rotations that I was able to go and meet him during my postings there. And he was a person who was an ardent complainer. He would complain of food not being very good, and he was a pure vegetarian. And he said, all that I need is some fruits. And of course, dietary would give us fruits. And I pointed out on his plate saying, yeah, there are some fruits there. And he said, this is so little. So what our registrars did, every time they came in for a shift, they would buy some bananas and something and come and give it to him, which he was very pleased. Now, I wouldn't be doing justice if I do not talk about financial discussions. Financial discussions was another big area of challenge. Thankfully, with especially Medicine One, where I work, we had social workers, and Mr. Gunaseelan, our social worker, who was a phenomenal asset to the team. He would, talk to the relatives, mobilize resources, and want to share about one Mrs. J. She was just a 45-year-old lady. She came in with COVID. She was admitted into the ICU, and she came from a low socioeconomic background. So at one point of time, our HOU, Dr. Anand, was saying, let's make a hospital free. And I remember the social worker, Mr. Gunaseelan, said, no, sir, her son is working in a place where they will give the insurance. Now, looking back, this lady went through such a stormy course, had a hemiplegia, had a very prolonged intubation, and then it took quite some time before we could get her out of the ICU and into the ward, and it was a very, very long duration. And that all translates to money. And you won't believe it, the insurance covered the entire amount. So having a social worker takes away that chunk of discussions, which are very important in this COVID-related COVID pandemic, because there are people who don't have resources, people who are out of their jobs, people who probably have resources but they don't know how to mobilize it. So having a social worker to do some of these discussions made a big, big difference. Now about spiritual dialogues. I know our reverend is going to talk a lot more about that, but I just can't stop, wind up before I talk about these spiritual dialogues. Do believe in a spiritual dimensions, do believe in afterlife. So what we would do in our wards is that as we go around doing our clinical work, you would pray for them. And once you start praying for one patient, the next bed you go, and if you try moving away without praying, they'd say, doctor, would you please pray with us? So we would do this. And I remember as I was moving on, there was this one other patient who was also a hemiplegic patient, but he had a left-sided hemiplegia. He was able to speak, but he was kind of mumbling away. And I decided in my mind not to pray for him. I said, okay, anyway, I don't think he understands much of what I'm saying. Let me move on. But somewhere deep within me, there was this impulse to go back and pray with the patient. So I told my registrar and I said, hey, can we just go back and just pray with him? So I went to this man and I said, is it okay if I pray with you? And he mumbled something, so I took it as assent. So I started praying for him. Halfway through my prayer, he just interrupted me. He said, doctor, do you know something? Last night, Jesus came to me and he said, do not be afraid. I'm with you. I was very, very surprised because I know this man probably didn't even realize I was praying and decided to say something. And, it was more of an encouragement to me because there was listening to that inner voice within me to say there's something more that I can do for this person, and that going back and praying for this patient. But actually, in a sense, the patient actually ministered back to me because I thought I was doing prayer as a a kind of a psychological event. Okay, I'm just praying with people, making them feel good, because most of our people are people who fear God, who believe in the infinite, and who believe in something that is superior. Here was God trying to tell me, no, I'm walking amidst them, I'm with them, I'm helping them, and your prayer makes a difference. So I think in communicating, we are communicating not only with patients, their relatives, but we are also communicating as a whole to someone in the universe who cares for all of us. I'll stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, ma'am. As we wait for our next speaker, it's interesting how we realize that COVID has brought in so many gaps in our communication. We should remember that perfect should not be the enemy of good. We should consciously acknowledge and engage with our patients, addressing their ideas, their concerns, and their expectations, even if it means death. Our next speaker, Dr. Jennifer Jeba, is Professor and Head of Palliative Care Department here in CMC. Her insight as an experienced and accomplished physician that has holistically dealt with patients, families, and their terminal illness will offer us a vital perspective on how we can manage delicate and difficult situations. She will share her recommendations in the management of terminal COVID patients. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Tarun, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining us for such an important aspect in COVID care. So in my outline, I will try and cover what, when, and for whom does palliative care need to be provided in the context of COVID-19, a bit about symptom management and end-of-life care. So a recent Lancet article described COVID as a tsunami of suffering, and this is a statement none of us can say no, both globally and individually. Going on to redefining palliative care for those who are not familiar with it, early this year, palliative care was redefined by an expert consensus definition, saying it is an active holistic care. I would like to emphasize it is an active care and it is a holistic care for individuals across all ages with serious health-related suffering due to severe illness, and especially for those near the end of life. The aim is to improve the quality of life of patients, families, and their caregivers, and this very much applies in a COVID pandemic situation. It is really encouraging to see that the World Health Assembly in May 2020 in their COVID-19 response resolution actually included palliative care services alongside safe testing and treatment. So palliative care is very much part of COVID-19 care. And this international task force actually says that healthcare professionals trained in providing palliative care should be involved where patients with serious COVID-19 have persistent symptoms and concerns despite optimal disease treatment. But is this possible in a country like ours where there is scarcity of trained healthcare professionals in palliative care? Maybe not. And that is why I am very encouraged that so many of you could join in here to hear this, because all healthcare providers are palliative care providers in this setting. So why is it such an essential part? We realize the disease trajectory here is very short, and those who progress actually have a rapid progression. Like mentioned earlier, the resource scarcity in terms of being able to provide intensive care to all those who need it is very real. The high mortality, especially among the elderly and those with comorbidities, is something we cannot be blind to. The distressing symptoms, both physically, psychosocially, and spiritually, the associated communication challenges, and the bereavement that carers would be left with, these all make palliative care be an essential component in COVID-19 response. But for whom and when should we really integrate palliative care? So like we discussed, in patients who have worsening illness and who have been clearly triaged, by the treating team with the patient or the family as not for intensive care, depending on their debility, their age, their prior comorbidities, and the present clinical progression of disease. If there are patients who have agreed on DNI DNR because of non-availability of ICU beds at that moment, active medical treatment continues with the hope of access to ICU care, but symptomatic management and relief of suffering also become a priority. In very occasional cases, we might come across patients who have decided we do not want ICU care and there is an advanced care plan, and that is respected, and that group also we offer palliative care. However, good symptom relief should be a priority across the disease trajectory. There are reports coming out saying that symptom burden in patients dying with COVID-19 is higher than patients dying without COVID-19. This is a series of the symptom burden in 101 patients with COVID-19 who were referred to hospital palliative care, and they were all referred either for symptom control or for end-of-life care, and we see the numbers are the actual number of patients. The total number is 101, so you can almost take it as percentage. The symptom which is highly prevalent is breathlessness, followed by agitation, drowsiness, delirium, and pain. And I would cover management of these symptoms during this lecture. We see that for 74% of these patients died, and the median time from referral to death was 2 days. As with any symptom, we do not assume that the symptom is refractory. We look for correctable causes, correct them, look for what non-pharmacological measures can help in symptom management, and then add on pharmacological treatment. We saw that breathlessness is a very common symptoms, and I might not elaborate on each of these because most of you would know what non-pharmacological measures we would do in our breathless patients, right from positioning to ventilation to loose clothing, applying cooling the face with wet cloth. What is not to be done is the use of portable fans or handheld fans because of the risk of aerosol dispersion. Outcomes of treatment with COVID patients tell us that symptom control in most cases is achieved with small doses of opioids and benzodiazepines. So patients presenting with serious COVID-19 with distressing breathlessness, despite optimal treatment of underlying causes, can be and should be given low dose opioids for palliative treatment of breathlessness. And this is not new in palliative care because opioids are widely used in palliative care to alleviate breathlessness. Small doses, carefully titrated, do not cause respiratory depression. So what we are talking here is small doses of opioids. So we have to decide whether someone needs or doesn't need opioids based on how breathless they are. If someone has moderate breathlessness and is able to take orally, we would recommend small doses of tablet morphine, IRS, immediate release or normal release, 2.5 to 5 milligrams for Thali and PRN. So morphine tablets come as 10 milligram tablets, so 2.5 will be 1/4 of that. And definitely in the elderly, do not start with 5, start with 2.5. In those with renal failure, it can be given just twice daily or thrice daily, and as and when needed, doses can be given. As the patient becomes severely ill and the breathlessness worsens, or they are not able to swallow, they are not conscious, you could convert the oral opioids, oral morphine, to subcutaneous morphine, and when you do that, you have to always half the oral dose. So you would give injection morphine 1.5 to 2.5 mg subcutaneously for Thali and PRN. Again, in an elderly, you might want to either increase the frequency, meaning keep it 6 Thali or 8 Thali, or give it twice daily and give as and when required doses. Always review the symptom and titrate the dose. Is there a role for benzodiazepines in handling breathlessness? Yes, they are considered when non-pharmacological measures and opioids are not sufficient to alleviate breathlessness, and also especially if the patient has got associated distress or anxiety. As the patient condition worsens and the breathlessness worsens, there will be or might be a role for adding on benzodiazepines anyway. If they are able to take it orally, tablet lorazepam 0.5 to 1 mg sublingually can produce a very quick relief in terms of anxiety or panic. Otherwise, we could give injection midazolam 1.5 to 2.5 mg subcutaneously. If the patient is really in the end of life and has got significant distressing breathlessness, which is sometimes called terminal breathlessness, continuous infusions of opioids and benzodiazepines can be given. The usual dose of morphine should depend on what the patient has been receiving prior to converting it into an infusion. So if the patient was receiving in 24 hours, say 15 or 20 mg, then we half it. It will be 7.5 or 10 mg depending on the prior dose and how much PRN the patient had needed. In addition to the opioids, midazolam can also be added 5 to 10 milligrams over 24 hours. This can be given together as a continuous infusion to alleviate dyspnea and distress at end of life. We know oxygen definitely improves survival in patients with severe hypoxemia and COVID-19. So very likely most patients would be on oxygen. However, there is no role for oxygen in those who are not hypoxic or if it is not really helping them symptomatically. Pain, a certain proportion of patients do have pain, and what is given for pain should be based again on the severity. For mild pain, something like paracetamol either orally or as injection should suffice. For moderate pain, it can be either weak opioids like tramadol, or if the place where you work actually has access to morphine, low dose morphine can be tried for moderate to severe pain. Start with tablet morphine 5 mg Q4 and PRN. Most patients when we start on opioids will have some nausea, vomiting and will have constipation. So always remember to add antiemetics and laxatives when you start opioids. Delirium and agitation is another common symptom. Try and keep the room where they are ventilated, well lit, with not too much of auditory or visual stimulation. Try to reorient the individual every time you meet, which part of the day and what's the time and what you are there for. Because presence of a familiar person may not be always possible in the situation, but however, like we heard with our previous speaker, someone was so agitated just by being there and holding their hand actually calmed that person down. Try and arrange some frequent telephonic or video calls with the family. What do we do in terms of medication? Haloperidol is useful in patients with agitated delirium. Start with 0.5 milligram and go up as needed. Towards the end of life, if agitation is a significant problem, this also can be given as a continuous subcutaneous infusion over 24 hours. If you think the patient is not settling down with haloperidol, midazolam can be given also as a continuous subcutaneous infusion. Respiratory secretions can lead to noisy secretory breathing, which can be quite, at this point, the patient himself or herself might not be really troubled by it, but if the family is seeing the patient over the phone or the video, it can be quite worrisome to the family. So please explain to the family that this is because he's not very conscious, not able to swallow the secretions, not able to bring it out. Reassure to the family that actually this is not distressing the patient and he or she is comfortable. Positioning the patient onto the side with the head elevated and allowing the secretions to drool can help. But most importantly is starting anti-secretory drugs quite early on. These may not be very helpful if the patient is actually got a lot of secretions and noisy breathing, but if you can look out for these and start it early on, either hyoscine butyl bromide 20 milligrams subcutaneously every 8 hours or give it as an infusion, then we can prevent this noisy secretory breathing. Pain and fever again can be an issue. Try and reduce room temperature, loose clothing, fluids if possible, cooling the face with wet cloth. Round the clock paracetamol can be helpful. NSAIDs are generally avoided, but towards the end of life, if they need to be given, it is not an absolute contraindication. So coming to how do I really know this patient is deteriorating, this patient is in the end of life, you will see progressive physical decline, worsening symptoms, patient is not moving much, not eating much, not talking much, and whatever you do in terms of active medical treatment is really not helping this patient. And this is a time when the focus of care really changes. Communication is vital. Dr. Punita has spoken about that. But our focus comes to how we can really keep this patient comfortable. So symptom control, trying not to do unnecessary interventions which are not going to act on. Review medications. Is this an essential medication? Is this going to help the patient in his or her symptom control? Is it going to make the person more comfortable? Always use anticipatory prescribing. We always leave PRN doses in case a patient becomes more breathless, in case the pain worsens, in case he or she is agitated. So there is a PRN prescription so that the person on the floor is, or the nurse can immediately give it when, as and when the problem comes, and they are not waiting for the doctor to communicate with someone senior and then get it done, and we do not waste time. Very important is also support of family and carers. I am not going into the psychosocial, spiritual distress and how we care for that. The following speaker will address that. But it's very important to realize that we do not give up on a patient. We do not say what more for this patient, there's nothing more for this patient, because the last part of life has an importance out of proportion to the length of life. And this is said by Dame Cicely Saunders, who is the founder of the modern hospice movement. I would like to also put up one more statement that she said, you matter because you are you. You matter till the last moment of your life, and we will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but to live until you die. What we mean here is to live with as much quality of life, with as much symptom relief until you die. And I just want to acknowledge here that care of the dying is not easy. All of us keep learning, and mostly at these times it is junior doctors who are on the floor round the clock, and they might feel they are not trained, they might find this challenging, they might find this helpless. So in CMC we've actually said that the palliative care unit is available for them to call up if they find any difficulty around end of life issues or any symptom management, because they also feel they want to do it right, they want to do the best for the patient, and there is a lot that can be done even in a difficult situation like this. And crucial end of life care at end of life is a crucial part of medical care, as we have emphasized on communication. Caring for the patient is actually being there and doing what is possible, and doing it compassionately, like Dr. Anand started this talk saying, we are the family which is there for them at the moment. So to do it with that compassion will make a huge difference. This is my last slide. I just want to re-emphasize that there is a role of palliative care in severe and critical COVID-19 illness. Effective symptom management is crucial. Consider the patient comfort always. Is the patient comfortable? It looks like the patient is in distress. What is it? So consider the patient comfort always. Provide holistic care. Don't think the small thing, how is it going to help? Small acts make big differences which you and me may not realize. And finally, you being there is a therapeutic intervention. Again, it's an immeasurable outcome. So I just want to thank you all who are being there on the floor and doing great services. I provided some resources for reading. Either some of them are from India and some of them are from across the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that lucid and informative protocol that speaks both to the heart and the mind. I can imagine myself actually reviewing a lot of these protocols in the ward, and I'm sure a lot of people out there have questions to ask. Simple measures that can provide a significant symptom relief. Next, Reverend Dr. Arul Das, the head of chaplaincy in CMC Vellore, will talk on the spiritual and pastoral dimension of caring for patients during these unprecedented times. Often when Pastor Arul Das shares his words of wisdom, I find myself reoriented with a different perspective and a kindled conscience. CMC provides a pastoral service for our patients during these times, and we're eager to hear what Reverend Dr. Arul Das has to say. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tarun, for this opportunity to be here and to share some of my thoughts connected to pastoral care, dying and death during COVID-19. Now, there are many changes which have happened, all are aware. Changes connected to our emotions, fear, uncertainty. There are many social changes. We are not able to gather, we are not able to travel. Many of us lost our jobs, changes in the work patterns, loss of income. The way we interact with one another, the way even we trust one another has changed. Therefore, in this changed scenario, what does it mean to say pastoral care? Pastoral care comes from an approach where we understand care as a multifaceted one. Often we say that there is physical, emotional, social, and spiritual dimensions. Care that incorporates the God of healing. Care that incorporates even that which we cannot see and touch. In the mission hospitals, quite often we have this dimension very beautifully intertwined. We have cross, for example, as the symbol of acceptance, welcome. We have God's word being taught, explained, interpreted, studied. We have a place of worship, a chapel or a chaplain, often denoting the spiritual dimension. In many contexts, we have prayers. We begin things with prayer, we end things with prayer, prayer being very central part of our life. These dimensions actually are included in pastoral care. So what has changed during this pandemic? Well, we who are pastoral caregivers, normally we are not able to visit patients. We cannot go as usual. We have to wear mask. We have to wear PPE before we go to the patients. The healing touch that we consider very important in the dimension of pastoral care, we have a lot of restrictions. We have to keep distance. Now, God is described as the wonderful counselor. And am I able to listen intensely in this pandemic time? When the face and the flexing of the muscles are hidden. How do I understand? Can I understand the other person's feeling through the eyes? How do I be there? Ministry of presence. And how do I share the holy sacraments with the people who faithfully ask for it? I remember in one context in MTS 4 ward, we had to take the holy sacraments through the dietary department. We are not allowed to take it as we are going. So there are many challenges. In one situation, one patient came and said, I haven't received Holy Communion for few months. Can you please arrange a Holy Sacrament? We realized that she is from another denomination, Catholic Church actually. But she said, no, it doesn't matter. I want to receive this Holy Sacrament. We arranged it. Holy Sacrament is very less frequent. Now, these are the changed scenario. Now, I want to say few things about dying and death. These are very difficult things to talk about, but we are facing every day. Therefore, let us say a few words about it. Now, do I have a choice of the venue where I want to die, where I would be dying? Do our patients who are affected by COVID, do they have a choice? No. Quite often they are put in a situation of ICUs. In the ICU, pastoral caregivers, it is very difficult to get into the ICU, quite often almost impossible. But there is pastoral care already happening, as our previous speakers already explained. And we also see there are so much separations when somebody is experiencing the process of dying. Physically, he or she is separated. Emotionally, they are separated. Even spiritually, they experience some separation sometimes. They are faced with uncomfortable questions. Questions like, what will happen to me if I die? What will happen to my loved ones when I die? Will I be able to bear this pain as I am dying? Some of the important feelings that they go through. Some of you may recollect earlier researcher Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who said there are different stages of dying. Actually, that is true. Even in the context of COVID, that's true. They go through feelings of anger when they know that their life is limited, their time is limited. Sometimes they deny, no, everything is fine, I'm going to be all right. They have fear, anxiety. The family members are upset. They have feelings like loneliness, depression. They bargain with God. God, give us some more time. I will be so good. I will be so righteous. I will give all my wealth to the poor. They also go through some times of acceptance. So all these things, there are some more things I would like to say. Some important issues they handle during this time. If they are sort of clear they are going to die, they would like to settle some of their accounts. They want to hand over many responsibilities. They want to even review their relationships. There are many things they are grateful about. They want to tell people that they are grateful. They would like to thank many people. They would like to say sorry to many people. They want to have a completion. Last rites in Holy Communion. which also facilitates forgiveness when somebody dies. In the COVID ward, all these things need to happen. How does it happen? We don't have many words to talk about. We don't have many words to communicate. They want to also deal with the meaning and purpose of life. They want to have the idea of what is happening, what is going to happen after this. After I die, what is going to happen? All these important issues are in their mind. I remember during these times, one person, I was involved in the telephone prayer, telephone counseling. He interacted with me. He said, my uncle passed away. He is the source of everything for me. He passed away. And after some time of talking, he said, I am just in front of the chapel. Can I meet you? And finally we met. He said, we spent about 20 minutes or more than half an hour just before the body was taken to their home. And we also had a small word of prayer. Of course, he came from another faith, but he also had familiarity with Christian faith. Therefore, he was very happy about the prayer also. And the way he said was, he was so grateful for that small interaction we had, small time of prayer we had. When somebody breathes the last, when somebody is declared dead, what next? How do we break this news to the family? These are very tough questions for anyone. Now, one more aspect we often ignore is the feelings of the healthcare staff, doctors, nurses, other staff members there. How do they feel about somebody passing away from their care? Somebody whom they cared for many days suddenly is no more. How do we take the body to the mortuary? How do we interact with the health authorities? All these questions are in their minds, particularly in the minds of the family members. My last slide is about some aspects of grief. Well, family members are shocked hearing the news. They're trying to locate what does it mean to lose my loved one. My husband is not there. My wife is not there. How do I handle? And how do I deal with these feelings of fears, anger, and burdens? I remember one situation where the father passed away, son was in quarantine. Who will take care of the funeral arrangements? Will there be prayer? How do we handle? I think as pastoral caregivers, as healthcare ministers, we can contribute little bit in these areas where there is a lot of uncertainty and difficulty. Is there some help available for burial or cremation? Will they get ashes after cremation? I think we can, as who are alive, who are willing to live, we can help. Who will conduct these things? Will there be respect? Who will participate in the funeral service? Where will be the burial? Will the cemetery be available? After burial rituals. And all these things are critical things where we can make some difference. I think in small way or big way, there have been some contributions in these areas. Our prayer is that God will help us in the midst of all this pandemic to help in this spiritual dimension also, to care for them, to be with them, and to share the pain with them. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. I think that was a really interesting talk that addressed the existential issues of not just doctors, but even the healthcare workers. It's an eye-opener that the spiritual is as important as the physical. And as a healthcare team, we need to go beyond the hospital-based care to the family and sometimes even afterlife care. I'd like to start posing some questions to the team. We'll start with Reverend Dr. Arul Das first, and then to Dr. Jeba, and finally with Dr. Punita. Please keep your questions coming. Sir, one of the questions raised was, how do you deal with the spiritual aspect of different faiths? I can imagine that there are three aspects here: the caregiver, the patient, and the institution. We may be fortunate for us to be able to communicate with our patients with freedom, but how do you see us, or how do you see workers at different parts of the country and all over the globe handling this interaction if the environment is not so congenial?
Thank you for this question. Well, actually, it calls for a great discipline from the caregiver's side, and also a broader understanding in the caregiver side. We do believe that the spiritual dimension, the spiritual care is available for everyone. And sometimes I being a Christian, I care in a particular way, the way I know. The way a Hindu patient or a Muslim patient receives that care may be different. But I'm able to provide that care from the faith that I come from. Quite often I have seen in my experience that has been very useful. There are very few instances where people have sort of rejected or negated. The spiritual care, we are going beyond the religion actually. When we talk about spiritual care, it is far beyond the religion.
Thank you, sir. I think another question that came up was, are there any available resources that can guide a clinician or a healthcare team in approaching these spiritual issues? And two, another question which has just come up is the role of the relationship between the treating team and the pastoral services. Maybe people would like to understand that dynamic.
Yes, we are so fortunate in CMC where this integration and cooperation is very good. The spiritual care team and the team which is doing the physical and the medical care. But in the places where it is not available, probably it is something needed where we do accept each other's contribution in the holistic care, holistic health we talk about. The final one is about the resources you talked about. Well, one immediate resource many of us can use is prayer. Prayer itself is a resource, and many have different patterns of prayer, many ways of prayer, but that itself is a big resource. Any healthcare team member can use, and scripture or the religious literature and people's experience, people's stories, they are other resources in the spiritual realm. And some other rituals like Holy Communion or any kind of spiritual practices like giving help to poor. All these things have different dimensions, spiritual dimensions into it, and I'm sure these can help in the way we consider the holistic care in a broader sense.
Thank you, sir. As we move on to Dr. Jennifer Jabba, I also wanted to say that it's very interesting that the spiritual is a very human experience. So irrespective of which religion it is, going down to that spiritual level can actually make a difference for any patient. Ma'am, there are a few questions here. If centers don't have morphine or lorazepam, as you mentioned in your protocol, what would one do for tramadol and diazepam? Are these options that can be used in peripheral centers where they don't have access to oral morphine?
Sure. So, thank you for that question. Oral morphine availability across the country is a big challenge. However, most COVID patients are admitted, and if the institution or the hospital has injection morphine, then that would be the first alternative, because there's a lot of evidence for palliation of dyspnea with morphine rather than any other drug. But if you don't have injection morphine also, then injection fentanyl is an option. If not, injection tramadol can be used. But I suppose most hospitals or institutions might have injection morphine. So if you're not having oral morphine, please use injection morphine.
And the endpoint of your pain and sedation, ma'am, what are we looking at the patient when we want to relieve pain? Is there a kind of score that one would look at? And even when you want to sedate, how do you know you're not sedating the patient too much?
Okay, thank you. So I used the word distress, I used the word comfort. So what we are trying to achieve is patient comfort. So sometimes a symptom like dyspnea, you will not be able to get the patient absolutely all right, even with all your pharmacological or non-pharmacological measures. You will not be able to get your patient without having that sense of dyspnea, but we are trying to get them to a level where they are comfortable. So I think what you're looking for is not really trying to get a score. You can ask the patient how he or she is feeling. So if it is for pain, usually our first goal will be, has the patient had a good night? Okay, if the patient is comfortable at night, then we look at through the day how you can make the patient comfortable. So we have goals like, are you having a good sleep? Are you comfortable? What is it that is limiting you that we are able to help? So it is not a target or a goal set by us, but you go by what the patient is suffering from, what the patient feels comfortable. The second question you asked was about sedation. So I have not at all spoken about sedation, because there is a term, or there is a place for something called palliative sedation, but what I have spoken of is really use of opioids and benzodiazepines for symptom control. At such small doses, we are only trying to get over their symptoms for which there is good evidence. However, in a very rare situation, occasional situation, there may be a patient who continues to have refractory symptoms of breathlessness or agitation, where you might want to step up on the dose to actually to identify that particular dose for that patient, where the patient is actually sedated so that the patient is free of symptoms. But the doses I have mentioned for for symptom management are nowhere near sedation. Sorry, I think I missed the bit about lorazepam. Lorazepam is very commonly available, but in case you're not having lorazepam, diazepam is a good alternative.
Just a more logistical issue, ma'am. As we have patients who we're taking care of and we've made a decision on non-escalation, we're keeping them comfortable and they're passing on, how do you suggest that the healthcare team engages with the patient and the family, and what really is happening to that patient? Do they know that they're dying?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So this is why I brought in some indicators for what might indicate that a patient is moving towards end of life. The healthcare worker, if the same healthcare worker had seen the patient yesterday to today, they would know that the patient is having a decline. Often patients also will know that they are not doing well and will say, this is a new problem, I'm afraid Sometimes they might even tell, I'm afraid I will die. Will I actually get out of this? So there will be definitely the healthcare worker can make out with worsening symptoms, no response to any of your active medical treatment, not eating, drowsy. So these all indicate that the patient is nearing end of life, provided there are no correctable causes. So we should not deem someone as end of life without being very sure this is not because of hyponatremia or any other correctable causes. So in such cases, it is good to communicate with the patient as much as the patient takes you. You do not want to push too much information which the patient is actually not comfortable with. But very crucial is also talking to the family, saying he or she is not as I saw yesterday, to keep the family with you as the patient moves on in the disease trajectory, to keep the family with you. You will know, you will know what you're sensing, you will know what the patient is actually understanding, where they are, and to keep the family along with you, I think provides a lot of satisfaction. And it takes effort, it takes sensitivity, it takes good communication skills, but I think that is something which can be a very positive thing happening to the doctor who is on the floor, because abruptly everything happens. You haven't spoken, they are not prepared, you were not prepared. These are difficult issues.
The last question, which I hope will also be continued by Dr. Punita, is the psychological distress faced by the healthcare team. How do you advise them to deal with these challenges, this sometimes futility of care? How do they protect themselves, or rather enrich or rejuvenate themselves?
Thank you very much for this pertinent question. This is something which I really wanted to bring into mind, but couldn't for lack of time. So we cannot ignore what's happening within ourselves, and unless we as healthcare professionals are rejuvenated and ready for it day after day, and this has been happening for months and we don't know how long we need to go on. It is very hard to provide care. We've been faced with mortality and difficulties at such a condensed form, as like never before. So it's very important to identify support systems for ourselves. Different places may have it differently, and much of it can come from within your team. Within your own group of colleagues, you can talk about it. It's very important to share what has happened. You might not, along with maintaining confidentiality, but this is what I went through. Vocalizing it, ventilating what's happening to you is important. It can happen with your own colleagues, it can happen with seniors, with mentors. You can identify groups. In CMC, we are trying to get a support group to help junior doctors identify seniors or mentors they can talk to, but it can happen right where you are within your own forums. If sometimes you might have to go and tell your supervisor, I am not able to, I need a break for a small period, meaning I cannot continue, and that is all right. To express what you're going through is important, and sometimes all of us need breaks to carry on. You can identify what helps you. It might be some of them have resorted to writing, exercising, music, praying, looking to God for help. No, maybe even the best thing would be to see, that what you're doing is something so crucial and so important and so heroic at this point in time. So some kind of positive reinforcement from yourself, from God, from people around you can be helpful.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for those excellent suggestions. I think very practical, very real. We go on to Dr. Punita. Ma'am, one question which has been raised is, a lot of the times patients may not be in a state to listen to what the treating team wants to do. So they might be physically restrained, they might be delirious, they're elderly. And how has CMC in the care of these patients tried to avoid this use of physical restraints?
Yeah. I don't think physical restraints are good at any point of time unless the person you feel is so agitated and would harm self or others. Then in those situations you may want to consider that, and even there you have certain guidelines. It can't be just done by one person. There has to be a consensus between the nursing team as well as the doctors before you decide on physical restraints. I remember in one of our patients, he was a real morbidly obese guy, young man who was on reservoir bag, and we didn't have that many ICU beds. This was early on in the phase of the pandemic, and so we didn't really have enough ICU beds. And this man was hypoxic, he was agitated, he wouldn't keep the mask, he was very violent. I remember morning had gone for rounds. By evening, when I called him up again in the evening, I was told that they had not even given him the DEXA because he'd pulled out the IV line. So then it meant that I had to go back again, and then we had to get some help from our psychiatric colleagues, and we did give him some haloperidol, small doses. So there was a chemical restraint that we had to do. Initially, we had to physically restrain him, and it took about 4 of us to just hold him down. But within the next day, the haloperidol had started working, and he was a lot better. And then we were able to get the access, and then thankfully he stayed on for almost a month, but he walked back home. So physical restraints not ideal, but if you have to do it for a very brief phase, you may have to do it for the sake of the patient, for the safety of the patient, and ultimately you're trying to do good for the patient. And of course you do explain. I remember this was a very funny conversation. We actually called his wife, and I remember the wife telling, "Hey, Suma, he was, in English for people who do not understand. The wife was telling the man, just stay quiet, let the doctors do what they need to do for you." So, we did have to tell the relatives, because on the video call, we didn't want them to see him suddenly on restraints. So we did get permission via phone with the wife and the children, and then we were able to do that.
Another question that's come up is, in a lot of centers where there's a fear of the attendants holding the hospital or the treating team accountable for inappropriate care when a patient has expired, what kind of strategies would you advise the team as they care for sick patients who may have adverse outcomes?
Can you just repeat that again?
What strategies would you have for a healthcare team who's managing a sick patient who may have an adverse outcome when dealing with the family?
So I think it comes, most people are reasonable, I would say. But having said that, there are times we do have people who are not very reasonable and who may want to blame the hospital for adverse outcomes. But the most important thing again here would be communication. If we are doing that on a daily basis, consistently, I think we would be able to avert some of these unfavorable responses from the attendants. We had one such issue where there was a communication gap. There was one team in the wards which was telling something to the relatives, and there was another team telling something else, and there was a communication gap. And obviously when the patient was not, the relatives were getting different messages, then they were upset that this was that we were doing something wrong. Then we had to sit and clarify. We had to talk between ourselves, and we found out where the issue was. It was a particular junior doctor who was giving some other information than what the patient was having. So then we had to really communicate within the team to make sure that we're not giving a wrong information or divided communication to the relatives.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that brings us to the end of the questions. Thank you for those stories, those useful insights.